Drum roll, please. It's taken BMW 50 years to make the best four-cylinder yet, and they still screwed it up. Today we're going to show you everything you need to know about the BMW B48. What's up guys, Alex Nelson here. Today we're taking a look at BMW's B48, one of their best four cylinders ever. Before we take a deep dive, we're gonna head on over to this 2020 330i and show you what the B48 looks like under the hood. So under the hood of our B48 TU equipped 330i, you're pretty much gonna see the same stuff on an F30 with a B48. There are major differences here if you're used to a previous BMW engine, especially if it was naturally aspirated. For example, on the four cylinders now, we have a split cooling system. So there's two expansion tanks. This one's for your intercooler and your low temp side. This one is for your main engine cooling circuit, although we'll get into how that's unique later on. The intake manifold and intake system on a TU no longer includes a front mount intercooler. It's all integrated just like the B58. The four cylinders also got this sweet intercooler integrated intake manifold. Unfortunately, while that's a step forward, step backwards, they put the oil filter housing just behind and to the side of the intake manifold. So accessing that is kind of a pain. And if you're a Mini Cooper owner with a B48, you'll know that the oil filter housing is actually underneath and you access everything from below where the skid pan is. Coming over to the left side of the engine, you can see BMW actually did away with a lot of the fuel system things that they ran on the N series engines. There is no longer the decoupling element, which is the little washer that the injectors sit on. There's no longer a conventional injector O-ring either. It's actually a direct steel fitting directly onto the rail. And there's a few nuances with that we'll talk about later in the video. This engine produces 255 horsepower and 295 pound-feet of torque, which, if you're listening carefully, that's the same amount of torque as a Mark 7 Golf R. So these engines, while they're in a base model, are actually pretty peppy and fun to drive, and with a few mods, they can do quite a bit of work. So now that you know what you're looking at, let's take a deeper dive over on the table and show you what can fail, some nuances of the engine, and the improvements BMW made to make the best four-cylinder so far. The BMW B48 is an all-aluminum, direct-injected 2-liter four-cylinder based on the BMW B series modular engine platform. It actually also shares parts with the N63 and has a few updates and improvements and consolidations over the BMW N series engines. It features a twin-scroll turbocharger, electric wastegate, dual VANOS with 253 degrees of adjustment. We'll get into why that number is so high later. Electric arc-sprayed cylinder walls, which are super tough. IROX coated upper bearings, which is very cool. We'll get into that soon as well. And a few general architectural things from the B series engine, such as the split cooling system we mentioned earlier, as well as brand new technologies like the heat management module, as well as this pesky oil filter housing that we'll talk about in a bit as well. And of course, a closed deck head, which has also made the B58 quite strong, and BMW has finally moved away from gaskets. This is a big deal. They're no longer using conventional gaskets on this engine. Most of the parts, such as this water pump I have right here, use a silicone bead, which, while needs to be installed with quite a bit of care and cleanliness, will last a lot longer than a gasket. So that's exciting. Thank you, BMW, for doing what the rest of the auto manufacturers have been doing for 20 years. So with that, let's get into the big question mark, which is, what in the world is a B46? And why does my car have one and not a B48? So in order to explain what a B46 is, we're first going to cover BMW's naming conventions. These days, it's a little bit different than it was with, say, the M52, and it goes something like this. A BMW engine will have 8 characters. The first being B, it's a BMW Group engine, that's all that stands for. The second character is the engine type, so the number of cylinders, 3 being 3 cylinders, 4 being 4 cylinders, 5 being 6 cylinders, and 6 and 8 being 8 and 10 cylinders, respectively. The next character, the third character, is going to be 6 or 8, which denotes a SULEV, super ultra low emission vehicle, or 8, which is just a standard turbo BMW engine. In our case, 6 is going to be B46, and 8 is B48. That's the only difference in the engine designation. A stands for transverse mounted. That's going to be in the 4th digit on the engine code, so a Mini Cooper would have a B48A and then the remaining information. So that means it's a transverse mount. The fifth and sixth characters are the displacement of the engine in liters. So 1.5 would mean 1.5, 2.0 would mean 2.0 liters. So if you had something like a B48 A15, that would be a 3-cylinder, non-SULEV, 1.5 liter transverse front mounted engine. Then you have the new performance classes. This is something that's new for BMW, and honestly, I think some of it's contrived with engine tuning and some of it's real, whether the engine got a turbo or not in some cases. It goes from K to S, K being the lowest, U being lower, M being middle, O being upper, T being top, and S being super. So something like an X2 M35i, that's going to have an S in that 7th engine digit, and something like a 316i in Europe, that will have a K, or denoting lowest output. Then finally, in the 8th digit, we have a new revision at 0, 1, which means first revision, and 2, which means second revision, which unfortunately for something like a N63 could mean that you actually have a 001, which isn't helpful at all for anyone. But that's BMW's engine designation in a nutshell. What does this mean for you? Well, if you looked up your BMW on a VIN decoder website and you saw that it had B46D or B48D, they are basically the exact same engine. It just means they're in a different emissions category, with 6 meaning SULEV and 8 being standard engine. We actually took the time to go through every single part of the engine through BMW TIS and take a look at the different components. And there are a couple differences, but none of them will limit how much horsepower you can make. They are only relevant to basically the politics of the engine. So the major parts that are the same between a B46 and a B48 are the engine block, pistons, connecting rods, heads, cams, valves, gaskets, and all head hardware, although I should say it's a silicone bead, not a gasket. The injectors remain the same, along with the high and low pressure fuel pumps. Things like the windage trays and all associated brackets and baffles, those are all the same as well. The valve cover and accessories are the same, the belt drive, dampers, and pulleys. Flywheel, torque converter, although yes, you could in theory bolt a manual B48 trans to a B46 in America. It's pretty unlikely that anyone will do that because I'm assuming the wiring would be insane. And because the crankshaft is the same between a B46 and a B48, they both use the same bearings, they both have IROX coating, they both use the same thrust bearings as well. All of the timing components are also identical, although we'll get into that later. The B48 and B48 TU have a totally different timing setup. The Valvetronic actuators, the oil pump, and the oil filter housing are also the same between a B46 and a B48. So if you really were concerned that your B46 wasn't a B48 or someone was making fun of you for not having a B48, rest assured they're the same thing. The only differences between the two engines is the catalytic converter, which you probably saw coming. This isn't that important except for the fact that because the catalytic converter is different, and on a B46 it features a V-band outlet instead of a band clamp outlet, this means that a European B48 exhaust for an earlier car, like the G20 behind me or an F30, wouldn't fit on a B46 for the front section because that band clamp is not compatible with the V-band. That said, you could probably buy a B48 catalytic converter and bolt it right onto a B46. I can't imagine that that would affect engine tuning all that much. And for those of you in Europe, you might have a differential pressure sensor as well mounted to your catalytic converter, which will feature a small metal pipe with a rubber hose that will probably fail. I'm sorry. As for the cars themselves, the only difference between a B46 and a B48 car is that the gas tanks are different and the active charcoal systems are a little bit different. But again, that's just the politics of the motor, whether it's a SULEV engine, super ultra low emission, or a conventional turbo DI motor. They're the same internally, same components. So if you're worried about putting port fueling on your car and making a bunch of power and it being a B46D and not a B48, it'll handle the same power. It's the same engine mechanically. All the maintenance items and everything you can buy at FCP Euro applies just as well to a B46 as it does to a B48. So with all that out of the way, I'll be referring to this engine as a B48 for the rest of the video because, well, it's a B48. The B48 TU started production in 2018 and was initially featured in the G23 series, like the one behind me, and the G29 Z4. It also, in America, was featured in the X2 M35i a little bit later, and that was actually the highest power output, punching well above its weight, trying to get probably into that Mercedes-AMG customer base territory, I would imagine. So while the B48 came in the late F30 from 2017 and up, it actually is not the same engine as what came in the G20 behind me. They are quite different, and the B48 TU got some significant improvements to performance and reliability. The headline figures are, a German would probably say that it's a technical update, an American would probably say that it's a completely different engine. They modified the head, they took 2.3 pounds out of the crankshaft, it has larger main bearings, still retaining that wonderful IROX coating. It has a larger turbo with an integrated air diverter. You can kind of think of that like a anti-surge protection valve. It doesn't really do much because it has tons of turbo flutter. Sounds awesome. They completely got rid of the front mount intercooler and went to an intercooler in the intake manifold style like the B58. They also changed from a twin timing chain setup with an idler sprocket to a single timing chain setup, which removed 2 timing chain guides, making the timing setup a whole lot simpler. They also updated the VANOS solenoids. They now have a different number of teeth, so they're non-interchangeable. And they also modified the belt drive so that now there's only one tensioner. So you can see a theme here. BMW is basically taking what worked, consolidating it, and trying to remove componentry to save cost, and with the side effect of improving reliability. And if you're coming from an F30 with an N20, I personally feel that the B48 is quite a big step up in terms of performance, delivery, and reliability from the N20. Taking reliability out of the equation and just talking about driving dynamics, if you're interested in buying a B48 powered car, you should know that they have a very natural power delivery. They're a little bit more top end friendly, sort of like a larger NA motor rather than a very heavily turbocharged small 4. And while they still have great turbocharger noises, they don't tend to fall off at the top, and they provide a very natural driving experience. BMW also did something never seen before really on any other BMW engine with the TU, B48 and B58, which is the split cooling system valve. This isn't actually between the low temp and high temp circuits necessarily. This is within the high temp circuit, and we'll get into that a bit later. It also got updated injectors from Bosch with 5,000 psi of fuel injector pressure. They did end up ditching the VDO Continental piezo injectors found in the N series engines and went with a much more traditional mechanical injector. Sorry, that was a lot. Now that you're a B48, B46 expert, let's get into the things you're going to need to know to keep one on the road. So right here we have something that many of you N55, N54, and N20 owners already know what I'm going to talk about, which is the PCV valve is no longer removable in any way from the valve cover. So even up to the first gen B58, there was a PCV valve, basically plastic welded right here, and you could chop it off, remove it, replace it, and put it back on if you really didn't want to mess with the valve cover. I think BMW caught on to that because now it is a fully integrated plastic block right here. It sits right here on the valve cover, and as you can see from the inside, there is no way to access this or replace it in any way. It's just part of the valve cover, which is unfortunate. Even on my own car behind me, this has already started to fail and cause oil to seep out of the oil cap. So if you shut the car off and you smell some sort of oil burning, or you get a suspicion of air leak in an air conducting system fault, it's probably because the PCV valve is failing and it's forcing crankcase pressure out of the various gaskets and orifices on the engine. So one way to check this is just shut your car off with the hood open and inspect the oil cap, and if it's kind of pooling oil around the oil cap and you see it splooging out, that's probably your PCV system starting to fail. And these tend to fail around 50 or 60,000 miles is when they'll start leaking, so be prepared for that. Like I said, that will require a complete replacement of the valve cover, which of course on this engine means removing the high pressure fuel pump because that is mounted to the engine. You'll need to spin the crank over until this cam is at bottom dead center on the fuel pump lobe. And then you'll also need to remove the injectors, which BMW revised heavily for this engine. I already mentioned that they're no longer a piezo crystal injector like the N series engine. They are now mechanical. However, BMW did change a couple things. So you might be familiar with this tool set. This is for removing and reinstalling and shaping the Teflon seal on these injectors. Unfortunately, on the B46, they actually changed the injector tip size. So this little arbor to slip the seal over no longer fits. So you're going to have to get the new B48 and B48 TU specific tool for the injectors to install those seals. Fortunately, BMW did away with a few parts connecting it to the fuel rail. So on these injectors, you no longer have a spring washer on the bottom, and you no longer have a O-ring seal or a gasket on the top. It actually has a machined kind of conical seat which interfaces with the fuel rail. And when you install the fuel rail, there's a specific tightening sequence to make sure that these seat appropriately and don't leak. This is good because it simplifies it and reduces the number of components you need to buy. This is bad because unless your workspace is very, very, very clean, it's pretty easy to get a piece of dirt on that metal surface and ruin the mating surface. So just watch out for that. This is, unfortunately, the worst part about the B48 and B58. This is the plastic oil filter housing. Now, engines have used plastic oil filter housings in the past, and it hasn't typically been that big of a problem. And thankfully for the first generation B48 in the F30, there's now an aluminum alternative to this. We carry it, Rhine produces it, and that's a must-have upgrade, especially before around 60 or 70,000 miles. But in the case of the TU, like on my car, there's nothing you can do but replace this plastic oil filter housing. Now, why is it such an issue? Well, you have coolant and oil running through the oil filter housing, obviously, and this sits against the block. These passages and gaskets are very, very close to each other. And what's been happening is these gaskets in between the oil and in between the coolant passages will actually start to soften, and the plastic beneath them will melt and move. In fact, this is a used unit with, I believe, around 50,000 miles on it. And you can already see that the gaskets and gasket channels are starting to have this very strange sort of melty, soft look to them, and it's just a poor design by BMW. They never should have chosen plastic for this. I'm sure it works under their warranty period, but that is just the reality of owning one of these engines. I'm sure the aftermarket will find an aluminum one of these very soon, and then we will have a solution, but for now, this is the Achilles heel of a B58 or B48, especially the TUs. When these O-rings fail, or when there's a melted piece of plastic in here, you will get oil transferring into your coolant or coolant transferring into your oil, which could lead to a whole host of engine failure related issues. You could have spun bearings, you could have scored engine components, you could even destroy camshafts. You really don't want that. So if you have one of these engines, especially a TU, get this replaced before 60,000 miles. I recently purchased this car, and it had 62,000 miles on it when I bought it, and we noticed that one of the bolts was actually cross-threaded from the oil filter housing into the intake manifold, which means someone's probably been in there and already replaced it. But loads of people are having issues with these around the 60-something thousand mile mark. Moving from one poor use of plastic over to another, we have the heat management module. Now, on a B48 non-TU, so in an F30 2017 and up, this is basically your thermostat. In a B48 TU, this isn't just your thermostat, it is also the split cooling valve, which is a new concept for BMW that splits the cooling system in the main high temp circuit between the head and the block. So that's what this little rotary valve on the side does, and we'll open this up and show you what's going on inside of it. This completely replaces the mechanical thermostat. So there's no longer a spring with a little metal puck that moves. This is doing all that functionality. In fact, in the B48, when you start it up, there is a coolant bypass valve which bypasses the mechanical water pump, much needed throwback to a mechanical water pump after the N series engine's electric water pumps. But there is a little bypass valve which bypasses this on startup, and then there's a pressure relief valve in the head which allows coolant to expand in the head and then flow over into this coolant pump before the heat management module or the bypass valve allow any coolant around the inside of the engine. It's a pretty gnarly strategy, but it seems to work fairly well, other than when the gaskets, which mate this heat management module to the block, start to fail. And actually, this is another used component, and I can already see that there was some sort of weepage or gasket failure happening here. Definitely check out your heat management module. These are also starting to fail around the 85 or 90,000 mile mark. And it's not necessarily the whole unit that fails, but it is these seals up against the block on the front of it. So with the heat management module taken apart, we can see the two different rotary valves. So this is the new thing for the TU. I'm just putting a 10mm on here to move it for you. So this right here is the split cooling valve, or SCV, and that is what regulates the flow between the head and the block. So that's probably for emissions, that's for cold starts. The block and head are also different thermal masses, so it's probably to help them heat and cool at good rates for longevity. Then this is the main rotary valve for the heat management module. So this is effectively your new thermostat. And what I find interesting is you see all these score marks on it. I don't think those were there from the factory. I have a feeling that's just from it riding on here. It's probably self-lubricated. Well, I found the wear surface. That's the bearing. That's their lubrication for that rotary valve. This white surface here is probably some sort of Teflon or Delrin or HDPE or whatever, and the ball rides against it. If you look very closely, you can see the wear marks on it. So just rest assured that your cooling system, every single time it changes, is getting microplastics in it. Check that out. So I wouldn't be surprised if these main rotary valve motors start to fail because there's coolant ingress into the motor. I wouldn't be surprised if someday, if this was left on whatever car it came off of, if you started to see coolant on the connector side and not just on the motor side, because that's actually moving. There's a rotary seal there. So safe to say, I wouldn't necessarily recommend buying a used one of these. And also, that's just totally fascinating. That's how it works. But kind of a wild strategy from BMW. I'm sure these will become very popular, flying out of our doors quite soon. As I said, the B48 non-TU and TU both feature a lack of gaskets. Now they still have rubber gaskets on big stuff like this valve cover, but they actually switched to silicone beads for a lot of different components on the engine. So this is a mechanical water pump, which is awesome to see again on a BMW flagship engine. Now BMW advises that when you install these, that you actually check to make sure that the silicone bead is consistent. And if it isn't, they have a specified Loctite sealant that you apply on top of the bead in order to make sure that it seals. Sort of wild, but seems to last, and my garage floor has been drop free, so I'm with it. I think it's a good strategy. On the downsides of the B48 cooling system, on non-TU, so F30 applications, the B48 has this heat expansion pipe which runs from the head over to the expansion tank. Now, unfortunately, these are very stiff with very minimal vibration relief. So what happens, as you can imagine, is that it actually breaks off right at the head. So if you are stranded on the side of the road with an F30 that's steaming, a 330i, it's probably this guy that's let loose right at the fitting. Unfortunately, they are kind of annoying to replace, but thankfully they're not that expensive, and if you catch it in time, you won't damage anything. You just have to replace a broken hose. On the TU side of things, the B48 has this little tricky guy here, which has been part of an actual recall by BMW. This is the fuel tank breather valve, and it sits just on top of the intake manifold. It's not actually held in with any fasteners, it's purely held in with clips, and if you wake up in the morning with a check engine light but no code in your iDrive system with a loss of fuel tank pressure when you scan the car, that is due to these gumming up. It's a pretty well-known issue. I think BMW just extended a warranty on these for 530i's as well, so it's affecting basically every car that has a B48 TU in it, and it's very cheap to replace, takes 5 minutes, fuel tank breather valve, must do if you get a random check engine light and you're not sure where it's coming from. Finally, we're going to talk about something that is probably just going to be a regular chapter in all of our BMW engine videos, which is the expansion tank. So this is the main expansion tank for the B48 and B58, and unfortunately these are also seam welded just like every other BMW expansion tank before them, and that causes them to fail. So if you see white streaks coming down from this split line here, it's time to replace your main expansion tank. The small one can usually be left alone because they don't seem to be much of an issue on B58 and B48 cars. However, this one is one to look out for. So with all this doom and gloom out of the way, I do want to talk about a few improvements the B48 has over its N20 four-cylinder direct injected predecessor. One of them being the IROX bearing coating. BMW claims in their own literature on the B48 TU and B48 engine release documents that during a start-stop situation, there is actually solid body contact between the bearing surfaces and the engine. This is pretty much BMW openly admitting that start-stop is eating your engine alive, and for N20 owners, I would highly recommend you turn that stuff off immediately. Basically, BMW has said outright that there is no way that an engine can be under load coming from 0 RPM up to idle and then, for example, driving away from a stoplight without having this solid body contact or metal-on-metal contact. So they've developed a bearing that can handle it. IROX coating is a red, basically resin matrix that they've applied to the upper bearings in the B48 and B58 in order to cope with start-stop scenarios and make the bearing basically bulletproof. It's an ultra-slippery substance that can be used at 0 engine oil pressure to protect the crankshaft and protect the bearing substrate. Now, this bearing coating isn't just great for efficiency, it's also great for making big power. We've seen so many B48s and B58s especially make big power, and I have no doubt that the IROX coating is a part of this. So if you have a B series engine, you should probably still turn off stop-start when you can, but rest assured that it has that IROX coating, which should keep it from eating itself. Now, another big improvement that BMW made isn't necessarily with reliability, but with feel. It's clear that BMW took it to heart when people weren't entirely pleased with the buzzy N20 4-cylinder, even though BMW's roots are in buzzy 4-cylinders. BMW added a second balance shaft to the B48, which is a pretty big move in order to place the B48 into higher-end luxury vehicles. What this means for the 3 Series and the Z4 is that, like myself, I'm sure other B48 owners have forgotten that the engine's actually running at idle because it's so smooth. Basically, when you have a 4-cylinder, the forces interacting with each other as the pistons speed up and slow down at different rates isn't perfectly canceled out like a straight 6, so you need a balance shaft to cancel those forces out. But when you add a balance shaft that's reciprocating inside of the engine to cancel out vertical reciprocation, you also add a side-to-side movement from that balance shaft being there in the first place. So in the B48, there is a crank gear, an idler gear, and a second balance shaft, and they spin opposite each other to cancel out each other's forces, making the B48 incredibly smooth. It's probably one of the most straight 6-like engines to have passengers ride along in. If you have a larger SUV or something like a hybrid 5 Series, they're not going to tell the difference between a B48 and a B58 equipped car other than maybe the sound and the torque delivery. It's a really smooth 4-cylinder engine. The B-Series engines also have larger bearings both in width and diameter than their N-Series predecessors, with the TU having larger bearing diameters still. BMW was basically lower compression, wider bearings, heavier block, larger internals. They were hot rodding an engine that they already made great over the predecessor, the N20 and the N55, which explains why they're so stout. YouTuber Vehicular DIY got, I believe, 582 wheel torque out of his B48 330i, which is completely insane. On the flip side, from horsepower to fuel economy, BMW has clearly done some pretty wild things to improve fuel economy outside of even just the cooling system upgrades. So BMW uses a combination of Valvetronic, the throttle body, and VANOS to manipulate PCV gases in the engine. Now, I don't even fully understand what they're doing with this strategy, but I do know that in BMW's own literature, they mention closing the throttle body almost all the way, moving the VANOS sprockets to one of their most advanced or retarded positions, and then opening Valvetronic in a way that creates PCV regulating vacuum within the engine. Now, from my understanding, I believe this is going to help what many N20 owners have suffered with, which is the engine cover reservoir getting full of oil, their PCV system getting full of junk, basically, or PCV issues such as the common oil sludge on the turbos on something like an N55 or S55. Given that the engine doesn't have a blow-off valve, I'd imagine they're trying to keep this system quite clean, and it definitely is showing. It seems like a lot of B48s aren't having too many PCV or gumming up issues outside of just the PCV valve itself failing. It's a pretty wild strategy, and this means that whether you have a B48 or a B58, you have an engine that achieves amazing fuel economy. I personally achieve between 34 and 39 mpg just on my daily commute, which is crazy. BMW also uses VANOS with significantly more adjustment than the previous generation for the purpose of adjusting volumetric efficiency. Similar to modern VW engines, BMW can close the intake valve early or late to adjust the effective volume of air used for combustion, increasing efficiency. It makes sense, as a 90% efficient burn of a smaller volume of air makes for less waste than a 90% efficient burn on a larger volume of air. And you have an engine that can deliver around 300 pound-feet of torque, 255 horsepower from the factory, which is probably faster than something like an E46 M3 off the line. So if you have either of those engines and you keep on top of these maintenance items, such as the oil filter housing, the heat management module, the valve cover, and any coolant leaks, you're pretty much guaranteed to have a bulletproof engine as long as you don't push it too far. The B48 and B48 TU haven't been out for that long, at least here in the United States, so time will tell if I get to add more to this table in the future. With that, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and leave a comment, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this, or head on over to our main channel to find out how to actually get your hands dirty and replace these components. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.